Good afternoon from London for a special webinar today focused on financial centres in Scotland, looking particularly at Edinburgh and Glasgow. We're very pleased to have with us today Sandy Begbie CBE, Chief Executive of Scottish Financial Enterprise, who's going to be talking through where the Scottish financial centres currently sit. In terms of thanks for today, you'll have seen the logos up on screen, and as always, would like to thank our sponsors at the FS Club for allowing us to range far and wide across the agendas of finance, innovation and technology. I'm Mike Wardle, I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the ZN Group, and I'll be your chair for today. And just a few pointers as to the webinar today. First of all, my job is really to introduce, but to get out of your way so you can hear from Sandy and his presentation. Sandy will speak for about 20 minutes, and there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of the session. If you've used the GoToWebinar platform before, you'll know how to ask a question. If you haven't, if you look at the dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a question tab into which you can type your question, and that'll come to us, and we'll field those as part of the Q&A. The session is being recorded today and will be available within maybe 24 hours, 48 hours after the event. So you can watch it again, of course, but also you can share it with any colleagues who you think might find it interesting. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Sandy Begbie, Chief Executive of Scottish Financial Enterprise, but with a long history of working in financial services, not only in Scotland, but in Asia, and really interested to hear what Sandy's going to bring us this afternoon. Over to you, Sandy.
Great, thanks, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone who's in the UK, and good morning or good evening to anyone who's joining from different parts of the world. So, as Mike said, I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, just to give you a sense of financial services here in Scotland, with a focus on Edinburgh and Glasgow as international financial centres. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. But just to start us off, I'm going to pose a question to the group. We'll take a few seconds for you to give the answer, and then we'll see what was the total exports for financial and business services growth sector in 2020. So this is exports from Scotland. Was it 5 billion, 10 billion, 12 billion, 16 billion or 20 billion? So if you could select one of those, then we'll see what the results produce. Okay, well, we have a tie at 16 billion and 20 billion. So I'm delighted to say that 38% of you got it correct. It's just switched 38%. Well, it's 16 billion in 2020. So it gives you a sense of the scale of exports and the importance for Scotland of our sector in that export space, and it has been on a growth trajectory for a number of years now. So let's move on to the next slide, just to give you a better sense of the scale of financial and related professional services industry here in Scotland. And we're just short of 9% of the national economy by gross value add, and then just short of 6% of national employment, which is around 150,000 jobs in the private sector. We're the second largest employer in the private sector, and that job number has remained fairly stable over a number of years. As I say, it contributes significantly also, given our relatively high salary base, to the tax base here in Scotland. We're the second largest financial services hub in the UK, outside of London and South East, and we've got over 350 years of history in financial services, which is hugely important in certain parts of the world. Mike referenced in his introduction that I'd spent quite a bit of time in Asia, and specifically in China and Hong Kong, but also some time in India. And Scotland's reputation in financial services travels very well into particular parts of Asia, who during my time with Standard Life were keen to be associated with the sector and the firm, given our longevity in the market. Also, we've had huge success in FinTech Scotland, highest rated in Europe for cluster management, and as I'll touch on a little bit more under Edinburgh, we now have a really strong FinTech cluster of well over 200 FinTechs here in Edinburgh, but increasingly moving outside of Edinburgh into other parts of Scotland. And we also have 4 Scottish universities ranked in the top 1% worldwide. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, St Andrews University was rated the top university here in the UK. So Scotland's history again in further and higher education is a key contributor to one of the key assets that we have as an industry here in Scotland. So if we move on to the next slide. So Edinburgh, which has traditionally been the focus of financial and professional services, over 50,000 jobs, or just over 50,000 jobs here in the capital. All key industry sectors represented, but we are especially well known for fund management and banking. And while that fund management focus may well be the household names that you'd recognise, for example, Baillie Gifford and Aberdeen, we also have many smaller boutique asset management firms here in Edinburgh who manage billions of pounds of assets. And also banking, obviously NatWest, its head office is in Edinburgh, but also we still have a significant presence amongst all the main banks and Lloyds Banking Group through their ownership of Bank of Scotland, and also other household names. So banking equally is strong here in Edinburgh. And we should also just call out the life and pensions industry as well, where you do have Standard Life as part of the Phoenix Group. You've got a big presence here from London, obviously Scottish Widows as part of the Lloyds Banking Group, and also Aegon as well, just to name some others. It equates to 14% of jobs in the city and almost 30% of the local economy, which is quite significant, and was rated 27th in the most recent Global Financial Centre Index report just published the other day. While that represents a slight fall from 21st in 2021, and clearly it's important that we understand what sits behind that fall. Clearly Edinburgh still holds a significant presence in the index itself. If you look a little bit below Edinburgh and just some of the recent developments and investments that we've had, we can continue to see the city going from strength to strength. And we're starting to see some real developments in the area of data, for example, where Edinburgh University have set themselves an objective of being the top university in Europe for data management, data strategies. And as a result of that, we've really started to see some of that broader investment coming into other financial and related services here in the city. So, a recent example was just last year when Capco almost doubled their headcount here in the city, and we also have increasing presences amongst some of the US banks who have also extended their headcount and are in the process of doing so to take advantage of that university sector and that focus on data. And of course asset managers as well, particularly in that ESG space. Then again, Scotland has a strong reputation in that ESG area, which we cannot be complacent about, but it's really important that we leverage the assets that we have, and clearly the university and universities is a key part of that. So Edinburgh, again, I also touched on earlier about FinTech. It has been a huge success story. When I came into this job 2 years ago, we had just over 130 FinTechs here in Edinburgh, but now that number is well over 200. And what we're seeing is investment coming from North America. Australia has equally been very successful. But however, again, it's important, as you'll have seen from the Global Financial Centre Index report that many cities in the world have a focus on fintech, and it's really important that we continue to invest and develop that as a key part of the sector. The final thing I would say is about Edinburgh is also professional services firms, which we have a long history of having all the main 4 firms represented, but increasingly also much more UK and local firms in that audit, accountancy, compliance, risk area specialist consultancies, which also continue to grow as the broader sector grows. So we get that positive knock-on impact. We move on to the next slide, and specifically looking at Glasgow. And there's a little bit more of a story behind Glasgow, which the headline numbers of 40,000 jobs clearly is a significant number of jobs, and the strengths in banking and insurance. But the shape of Glasgow and the sector has changed over the years that I've been involved in financial services here in Scotland. Where Glasgow historically was predominantly associated with what would be referred to as back office and voice, so you would say the more operational end of financial services. Over the last few years, it has definitely changed shape. Most notably, you've had, for example, investment by Barclays, a significant investment of hundreds of millions in a new campus in the city centre, which has a capacity of just around 5,000 people at the moment, and that will continue to grow. But they've taken the strategic decision to place a strategic hub in Glasgow, focusing around tech, but also around second and third line roles, innovation. They've got an Eagle Lab around supporting startup and innovative companies as part of that campus as well. So a very impressive investment. But then you've also seen investment from people like Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan, who JP Morgan themselves are building a whole new campus in Glasgow, which they'll move into next year, and have really made that their centre for technology across Europe, and will ultimately be employing up to 3,000 people. And Morgan Stanley announced just the other week there a further 200 jobs being added in Glasgow again, in much more what we would say is high value end roles. So Glasgow, as its profile over the years, has increasingly changed, and as a result attracting higher paid and more professional jobs into the industry. You've obviously still got huge strengths in the university sector. You've got University of Glasgow, Strathclyde, together with a very strong college sector, and that also supports the development of the industry. With Barclays, for example, with the number of jobs that they looked at, they partnered very effectively with the universities and colleges to access that talent. So almost 9.5% of jobs in the city, so not far off the same level as in Edinburgh. 18% of the local economy comes from our sector, and 43rd in the most recent index. However, what I would point out that Glasgow has moved up substantially from being, I think it was around about 64th or 65th a couple of years ago. So it's seen real significant steps up the index as a lot of these investments have come through. And again, as a result of those investments, we've also seen the strength of the professional services network also grow. PwC, for example, earlier this year announced 100 new roles in the financial services practice, many of them based in Glasgow. And you've got other bodies like the ACCA as well, who also continue to grow and develop their profile in Glasgow. So that core investment then has that positive effect in other areas. And some of the legal firms as well, both in Edinburgh and Glasgow, have also expanded their footprint as our industry has grown and developed. Go to the next slide, please. and maybe just touch on a little bit about the key strengths as a location and why is Scotland being successful in that regard. A couple of key points I would make reference here. One is EY produce a report on foreign direct investment each year. Scotland has continued to come out strongly in that report. Very often, in fact 8 times in the last 10 years, it's been number 2 to London. So we are very strong in attracting that overseas investment. So therefore, you ask the question, why does the industry and the sector continue to perform strongly in that regard? And we think it comes down to sort of 3 or 4 key reasons. First, and the thing that comes up consistently when I speak to both businesses that are here in Scotland, but also looking to invest in Scotland, maybe for the first time, is the depth, breadth and maturity of our financial services ecosystem. As I mentioned earlier, over 350 years, the sector has been growing and developing. Importantly, all areas of the sector are represented at scale. So whether you are a private equity firm, whether you're an angel investor, whether you are looking at, for example, accessing a public investment through, for example, the recently launched Scottish National Investment Bank, right through to mainstream banks, asset managers, life and pension firms, but also the broader professional services sector, it is extremely mature. And what that means is, if you choose to come to Scotland, then there is a ready-made ecosystem for firms to plug into. And when I speak to investors and firms, that's one of the key attractions that maybe makes Scotland, Edinburgh, Glasgow, stand out a little bit from other parts of the UK other than London. But also in some ways, Scotland's size also plays to its advantage, whereby it's relatively easy to make those connections, to have the right conversations and to get time with key people right across that ecosystem. It's also important that we, at that depth, breadth and maturity also reflects the fact that we take account of assets at a UK level. We benefit hugely from having a highly regarded UK regulatory regime, one of the best regarded in the world. It obviously has a long legacy of performing really well, and that's a real strength that we look to leverage. But also we take advantage of issues that are devolved in the Scottish Parliament. One in particular that's of interest to us is around skills and the way that our industry can really try and influence how the further and higher education, secondary education system works to ensure that that flow of talent is coming into our industry. Earlier this year, at the end of April, we launched our skills and inclusion plan for the industry. In collaboration with our members, we reckon there's about 50,000 opportunities in our industry over the next 3 years, covering a range of skill areas from data, cyber, digitalisation, AI, customer journey, product design. And that's maybe a different skill set, or certainly an increase in the requirement in those skill sets than we may have had in the past. But 50,000 opportunities, that's more or less to support the turnover in the sector with a bit of growth. But we've gone out to further and higher education, asking for them to engage with us about how they can best respond to our demand as a sector. And that then leads us into talent and innovation, the connectivity with our universities, our green finance credentials, our FinTech cluster, and the talent pools, which, while do tend to focus on Edinburgh and Glasgow, are increasingly, we're seeing investment coming into Stirling, into Dundee, Perth, Aberdeen and Inverness. We also had Barclays, a big investment in Kilmarnock. So we can start to see some of that investment also reaching out at the central belt into other areas, which again take advantage of some of the strengths that we've got in the university sector. What I would also highlight there is around Scotland's credentials, but also its ambition around green finance. And the fact is that we are doing a piece of work that SFE are convening right now around what should our ambition be on a global basis, or a global stage for that green finance area, because we do think, particularly with our strength in asset management, that we have got an opportunity to carve out something that continues to make Scotland unique and have a real strength in our sector on a global basis. And then the final one's around value, which is quality of life versus together with costs to operate. Relatively speaking, a lot of our firms will also say that the cost to operate out of Scotland is, relatively speaking, lower than London and many other major cities. But you have that flow of talent, so you've got access to a high quality talent base, but you can also offer a quality of life to people that they may not necessarily get in those larger cities. Obviously, we've got obviously known for our arts and culture, food and drink, and also outdoor activity. But we also try and play on the fact that we're a very livable community, whereby commuting is a lot easier, and actually people can move around quite freely. So what we've also found when some of the overseas banks move jobs here, and also some of the banks from elsewhere, particularly banks, what we are finding is that people are moving with those jobs and coming to live and work here in Scotland. Maybe a couple of final points and then we'll open up for questions. I think while we talk about Edinburgh and Glasgow as two centres, they are 36 miles apart, it's really important that we continue to develop the connectivity between the two. So hopefully what I've tried to bring alive today is that we've got two very strong financial centres here in Scotland, each with their own respective strengths. But increasingly what we're trying to do is market on a global basis the strength of putting those two together. And when you fold in the surrounding areas, then actually we've got a very strong base from which investors would think about coming to set up and establish a footprint here in Scotland. And then the final thing I would just add is that obviously this report is hugely important for us, but one of the things that we're also trying to do here at SFE is to learn from other centres and how they are developing themselves. Just under a year ago we did some benchmarking with about 8 different centres who were more or less in a similar position on the index to Edinburgh and Glasgow. And we've learned quite a lot around how they've developed their strategies to compete with, in many cases, slightly larger centres relatively nearby. Clearly we've got London, so we looked at places like Montreal, we looked at places like Milan, we also looked at Busan, but also looked at places like Dublin and Luxembourg, who have developed a really strong footprint in particular areas of our sector. So we're always trying to learn. This is why this report is hugely important for us. Hopefully what I've tried to do is to bring alive a little bit about financial services here in Scotland and some of the recent developments and where we're going in the future. And with that, Mike, I'll pass you back for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sandy, for that great overview of where things are and the exciting developments you've picked out as we've gone through. So we're going to move on to questions. The first one is really from me is this whole question of sort of green finance, green credentials. Do you think the hosting of COP26 has made a difference to the way that people perceive Scottish finance? Is that kind of international event, does that make a difference to how you're seen?
Yes, but I'm going to just put a little bit of caveat around it, Mike. I would say that having an event like COP26 clearly brings a lot of focus and did bring a lot of focus on Glasgow. I think the key is how the sector responds to that and continues to build post COP26. And I think that we're still working through some of the opportunities that come from that, and I think it's important that we maintain that momentum and focus. I mean, there is no doubt since COP26 we've had a lot of major shocks to global economy and the UK economy, which of course can at times present a distraction to some of that focus as well. And therefore it's really important that we don't lose sight of that. So I mentioned one of our key strategic themes was around skills and inclusion. One of the other, we've got four, but one of the other ones is around journey to net zero, and the work that we're doing with some of our members around trying to really think 5 to 10 years out to say what should Scotland's ambition, Edinburgh, Glasgow's ambition be in that ESG space, and really start to try and build that out from there. Secondly, I would say is that we're also working closely with UK and Scottish governments around how do we best address that journey to net zero in certain key areas. So home and buildings insulation is a good one, for example, which we know is a major challenge for the whole of the UK. But how do we best connect our members and their capital with the need, and how do we do that in a way that works for everyone? And so that's quite a big piece of work that we're involved in at the moment. So answer the question is yes, it has. But I think that to really fully build that legacy, we need to continue to work at it.
That's great. And Kevin Parker, who we know, has a sort of follow-up question about, could you comment on the links between the financial sector in Scotland and the focus on renewables, which is part of where Scotland's industry is developing, solar, tidal, onshore wind, etc. How important is that linkage?
Great question, Kevin. It's really important. One of the things, so we do believe that Scotland has two, it's probably got maybe two or three, but certainly two of our real global industries, global leading industries, are financial services and our energy sector. And increasingly we're working closely with some of the big energy firms around this just transition. We are collectively making a call on UK and Scottish Government to host a financial services and energy summit here in Scotland, which would be about how do we best collaborate between governments, the energy industry and financial services in order to accelerate that just transition. Clearly there's been obviously a lot of changes politically over the last few months, but we're still hopeful that that will happen between now and the end of the year. So we are really trying to work hard on how can we connect those two sectors better together, recognising that really it's going to take government policy, it's going to take funding, and it's going to take the developments in the renewables and more broadly the energy sector to really deliver that just transition.
Yes, that's great. And one of the things we know about green finance is that it's still driven by government and policy and regulation. It's not yet fully market driven. So I think you're right to pick out that need. Got a question here from Abel Abo. He says, thank you, first of all, for sharing your insights about Edinburgh and Glasgow's financial strengths. He says that as someone living in Scotland but who works in the City of London, what's your approach, or what's SFC's approach to attracting and retaining diverse talents, knowing that the prosperity of Scotland lies in the talents and keeping them in Scotland?
Yeah, so again, really good question. I mean, our report that we launched at the end of April was deliberately called Skills and Inclusion, because we are aiming to address two connected issues, but different. So one is around the different skills that we need in the industry and our forecast need over the next 3 years. But secondly is how do we make the industry much more inclusive? So we did a piece of research at the start of that which highlighted, certainly particularly amongst young people, that the industry still has a perception that it needs to change, and the perception continues to be that it is for relatively well-educated, university-educated graduates, usually middle class background, and also predominantly those white, can at times still be male backgrounds. So we are really trying to do work in schools. We do a lot of work into secondary schools and into colleges, aiming to change that perception. And really try and make sure that when we look back in 3 years' time, not only have we addressed the skills challenge, but we've also got a much more diverse and inclusive industry as a result of that. So it's a really good point. I think also the point about living in Scotland, working in London, where we have seen some benefit, and I think it's COVID has probably partly accelerated this, is firms either moving jobs to Scotland, and we've had some examples of that, again, Barclays being a big example of that, but other firms as well who have moved jobs to Scotland or allowed people to work in Scotland and maybe work from home 2/3 of the time or 3/4 of the time and be in London for 4 or 5 days a month. So that greater flexibility around the office working, so far anyway, I would say Scotland's been a net benefactor as a result of that changing work patterns. But it also makes commercial sense for some of these businesses as well, because the similar jobs in Scotland would normally cost slightly less than they would in London.
That's great. And after the event, we'll put you in touch with people who've asked questions. So if you want to follow up with Abel and persuade him to come back to Scotland to work, then you can do so. I've got a question here from Matthew Garanta, who it follows on quite well to what you've just been saying. Just asking, how complete and self-sufficient do you think the financial sector is in London? In other words, are there things you'd like to see developed so that people don't have to go to London for resources or facilities or for services as much as it's felt they currently do?
So I would say we are pretty self-sufficient. The one area that I still think that we need to grow a little bit more is in the private equity and that early investment stage. We've part of the Scottish Government strategy is around having a much more entrepreneurial culture, startup business, but you'll find that there is still a gap in that funding market which takes startups and scale-ups, and I think that we still need to do more to attract more into that area. But I think that beyond that, and I think elsewhere, I think we're pretty self-sufficient. We probably don't talk about it enough, and that's something that I think that we are increasingly focusing on is how do we really talk about that strength in the ecosystem. But there's no doubt in that early stage investment we could still do with some additional presence.
That's really clear, and that's an invitation, of course, to anyone working in private finance to come and talk to you.
Yes.
Absolutely. A question from Alexander McKay, just asking, what proportion of the financial sector in Scotland is Scottish owned, and what proportion is owned sort of elsewhere in the UK? It's really getting at what proportion of profits, I guess, are, into the UK economy or are coming back into the Scottish economy.
I'll need to come back to you on that. I mean, I think what I would say, Mike, is we break our membership, not break our membership down, but we've probably got 4 different types of members. So we have headquartered firms in Scotland. So NatWest is a good example. Aberdeen's another one, Baillie Gifford. So you've got big firms who are headquartered here. You then have UK businesses that have got significant footprints here in Scotland. So you've got Lloyds Banking Group as a good example. Phoenix is another one with the Standard Life business. So you've got businesses who have got, as I say, UK businesses that have got significant footprints in Scotland. You then have small Scottish, more or less Scottish businesses that are focused on the Scottish market. So you've got smaller professional services firms. You may have some smaller Scottish financial services firms, particularly maybe in the wealth space and etc. And then you've got what we say is the large international firms that have a significant presence here. So more often than not, that falls into areas like tech and data, etc. So JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley are good examples. But you've also got State Street, BNY Mellon, BNP, etc. All of whom have got good footprints here in Scotland. But also then you've got others like Aegon, for example, who's a Dutch company owning Aegon, as obviously the life and pensions business here. So we'll see what data we've got. So we'll all come back, but it probably breaks down into those sort of 4 different categories, more or less, in terms of the bulk of our membership. That's
great. Graham Brough has 2 questions. I'll ask them separately. The first one, do you have any other feedback on what attracts new international customers? There's obviously the legal and regulatory framework, and just wondering whether the skill-based reputation in Scotland is partly built on staff retention and the fact that people stay in specialist careers, and don't perhaps move around as much as they might in other economies.
The latter point's an interesting one. I mean, there's evidence to suggest that people do leave Scotland to go and work elsewhere in London to progress their career. So we are keen to ensure that we try and retain, but also have attract higher levels of jobs to here in Scotland. I think the skill base point, I think, is a lot of that does come down to universities, and I think the strength in the universities that we've got. And there was an interesting stat 2 or 3 months ago which said that Edinburgh, for example, has the highest percentage of students that come to Edinburgh that stay in, and so come to the university and then stay. And a lot of that's to do with the broader quality of life point that I was trying to make. So students will come to study in Edinburgh and then will stay or want to stay in Edinburgh to live and work. So the skill one, I think, linked to that quality of life is a key aspect for us. People moving around, I think that I can assure you that there are firms that we've got who are experiencing high levels of turnover at the moment. Some of that's within the sector, but likewise, what we're also finding is that some of the skills that we've now got in our sector are hugely attractive to other sectors as well. So the transferable nature of a lot of these skills, particularly in the tech and data space, are hugely transferable out of our industry into many other industries.
I think that it's an important point across all financial centres I'm talking to, is the whole point that financial skills are only part of the story, and digital skills, data skills are increasingly important across all aspects of finance, and the skill base needs to reflect that, not only for the financial economy, but also the wider economy, just about everywhere in the world. That's the message we're hearing. Graham's second question is just about where Dundee sits in the picture, saying it's obviously very proud of its financial sector and background and history, but just wondering whether it will still be a major player in 20 years or whether the central belt will really dominate and draw activity in.
So I think time will tell. I mean, what you've seen is some recent investments in FinTech space up in Dundee. So they've got the development along the waterfront, the technology centre that they developed on the former Michelin tyre site as well as another interesting development. So I think that what you're starting to see is money flowing into Dundee. You had Lloyd's acquisition of Embark, which happened a few months ago. They're running that as a separate entity. They're putting a lot of money into Dundee, into the skills system to grow that business. So I'm hopeful that Dundee will actually create its own space in the ecosystem, and that you'll see that investment continue. I think it's important. I think our industry also needs to play its part in regeneration, and I think you can see the impact of the Barclays and the JP Morgan and the other investments in Glasgow in the city centre. And Dundee needs that regeneration as well. And as a sector, I think that we've got an opportunity to play our part in helping Dundee's ongoing regeneration as a city.
Mm-hmm. We're sort of getting towards the end of the session, so please, if you have any further questions to put in, please do put them in. Kevin Parker has commented, of course, that Dundee University has a global reputation in medical research, and early stage investors are certainly going to look at what's going on there. Abel has come back with another comment and question, just saying it would be nice to see deeper collaboration with the Data Lab Scotland and between the Data Lab and SFE as regards data skills in the financial services sector across both cities. I don't know, it's more of a comment than a question, but anything to add to that?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, and we're in conversations with Smart Data Foundry at the moment, actually, about how we can take forward that collaboration. You've already had a couple of, like NatWest, for example, who are doing quite a lot with Edinburgh University in that data space. So you've got some of our larger members who are investing in that capability. But we're looking at how we as SFE can better connect with some of the work that's happening at Edinburgh University. I can see Edinburgh University will be quite a key partner for us going forward. So those conversations are live as we speak.
Personally, I was interested to hear you describe in your introduction about the work you've done talking to other cities that are kind of smaller cities as satellites of larger centres. And just wondered, does having London in the same regulatory jurisdiction, does it help or hinder Scottish finance, do you think?
It's a bit of both, Mike. I mean, I think that, and I say that as in the sense that we benefit from undoubtedly having London as it comes out consistently number 2. So you've got a very strong asset, and we are very keen to make sure that when we are talking to overseas investors and firms that are looking to set up, that we can bring a message. We do quite a lot of work with City UK now about how can we bring a message about the collective strength of the sector here in the UK, because actually your reasons for going to London are probably going to be different than your reasons to go to Glasgow, for example, and actually it's in all our interests to better connect and collaborate on that. Yes, sometimes the conversation around financial services, it sometimes feels as though it stops and starts inside the M25. So you get that impression. But we are as a trade body I think we're getting cut through with our message about being the next largest centre outside of London and the South East, and actually we've got different strengths that we can bring to that, and therefore we're doing more and more in London as a result of that. But we do benefit. So overall, I would say we're a net benefit of having London there. And that's kind of the message we heard from some of the other centres that we spoke to, whether they were close to, whether it was Boston being close to New York, or Montreal to Toronto, or Busan to Seoul, etc. Actually, they had all managed to carve out a position for themselves that also allowed them to take advantage of that sort of bigger centre nearby. So I still think we've still got some work just around the narrative and how do we do that. But I think that's going to be a focus for us.
That's super. So we're coming to the end, and thank you, Sandy, for that engagement. We will pass on details of people who ask questions, so that if there's further follow-up, you can take that forward. So it's down to me to bring the session to a close. First of all, thanks to our sponsors again. They do support us at the FS Club in running these series of webinars, and we are extremely grateful for their continued support. Looking forward, we've got some events coming up in the diary. Monday, avoiding financial crises. And I think Mr. Quating maybe should have attended that one before giving his mini budget. We'll see. On Wednesday next week, personal data, looking at the new charitable economic asset. On Thursday, looking at American foreign policy, and Monday the 17th, satellite-based sustainability data. So a really engaging and wide-ranging set of events coming up over the next week or so. It just remains for me to offer some thanks. First of all, to the audience, thank you very much for your participation and attendance today. As I said, a recording of the session will be up online on our site within 48 hours. Please do share it with others who you think might be interested. But really, mainly, my task is to thank Sandy for a stimulating presentation and engagement with the answers. Normally, Sandy, in a event, we'd have a round of applause. Instead, you're going to have to make do with a very small round of applause from me. But really, it has been a very engaging session. Thank you very much. And we look forward to continuing to work with SFE going forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you very much.